Today's study is found in Job chapter 32 through 37. The title of our lesson today is Words from a Young Man, and it is dated November 15th of 2020. It's lesson number 11 in your quarterly. It's found on page 76. If you don't have a quarterly, do not fret. We will lead you right through this lesson, and we'll see what the Lord has in store for us today in these chapters. We will not do an extensive study in all of these chapters, but we will shed light on what the writers have brought out here. We'll be focusing in on chapter, a little bit, so a few verses in that, chapter 32, and we'll also be over in chapter number 37 as well. Also in 33 as well, chapter 33 as well, we'll focus in. With that being said, let's dive right into our lesson today, and let's see where Holy Spirit leads us today. Our application there is found on page 76. It states that the student will see another perspective to trials and realize that God is always working for the benefit of His children in all things. So we hope that we can glean that from our lesson today, and we can have a little bit better understanding of that. We'll learn a little bit more about Elihu and more about Job and more about his three friends as well. We talk about this young man named Elihu, and we'll be introduced to him in chapter 32, verse 2, but I want to kind of give you an idea of who Elihu was and what we know. It's very little of what we know about. This is the only place that he's mentioned here is in the book of Job. But we know his name means he is my God. We also know that his father's name was Barachel, and he was of the Buzrite tribe, which was the tribe of Buz. Well, who was Buz? Buz was the second son of Nahor. Nahor was Abraham's brother. So we know that the Barachel, which was Elihu's father, his name means God blesses. And he was of the tribe of Buz, which was the son of Nahor, which was Abraham's brother. So all this implies that this family believed in God by their names that they had there. So we do know that. Now, God is sovereign and not answerable to any person. We've shed light on that in our previous lessons, but we must have an understanding of that even today, that God is a sovereign God, and He's not answerable to any person. He does what He wants to do, and everything He does is right. Now, according to Elihu's four speeches, which he has four different speeches, if you will, they all just tie right into each other, but it stretches through chapters 32 through 37, these four speeches. In these four speeches, he states that God has the right to remain silent and still be just and sovereign. Just because God is not saying anything and is not speaking to you and is not answering your prayers does not mean that he's no longer sovereign or he's no longer just. Even though he remains silent, he is still just and still sovereign. This is kind of what some of the points that Elihu was trying to make here. And also, to understand true suffering, we must see God's glory. We must see beyond the suffering and see God's glory. Today, if we stop and just look straight at what's going on in this world today, of all the travesties that's going on, all the sin that's going on, then we would be miserable. But we don't do that as children of God. We don't do that. We look beyond this world to God's glory and to His eternal kingdom. And that is what we are to do. And this is kind of what Elihu was presenting to Job at this time. Now, we know that Elihu was a young man, that Job and his three friends were elders. And so we'll speak of that here in just a moment. But many accuse Elihu of being a brash young fool. And he was brash. He was a little arrogant, if you will. Writers have many different things that they write about this young man, Elihu. Some writers believe that he was entirely wrong in what he was doing. He was completely disrespectful. Others believe that he was entirely right at what he did. I'm kind of in the middle of the road. I believe that Elihu was led properly, and he wanted what was best for Job, but I don't think he was entirely right on everything that he said. But I do believe, and I'll make point of this here in just a moment, that I believe he was closer to the truth than Job's three friends were. So many still accuse Elihu of being a brash young fool. However, God never condemns him. In the Bible, God never condemns him like He did Job's three friends. And so Elihu's response may not have been perfect, and I don't believe it was perfect. However, it was much closer to the truth than the others, and more importantly, it prepared the way for God's appearance in chapter 38, which we'll study about next week. Chapter 38, God's going to come on the scene. So it's kind of that this speech that Elihu has is the bridge, if you will, between what his three friends and what Job was going through, and the fact that God was going to make an appearance and speak directly to Job. So it's my belief that it prepared the way for God's speech. Even though it wasn't perfect, it was closer than his other three friends. So we'll look at our lessons today. We have three parts, and they jump around a little bit, so but I'll lead you through these. The first part is God does not answer to men. We're going to look at chapter 32, verses 1 through 4, and also chapter 33, verses 8 through 13. And then we'll jump over to, in our second part, God uses suffering to benefit man when we look at chapter 37, verses 17 through 18, and 28 through 30. The original plan for this part was just verses 29 and 30, but I want to look at some other verses there in the second part. And then we'll finish up our study in our third part, men should not question God. And we'll be looking at chapter 37. We'll look at verse 14 and also verses 21 through 24. So in our first part, God does not answer to men. Let's look at chapter 32, verses 1 through 4 to get things started. So these three men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Then was kindled the wrath of Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzrite, of the kindred of Ram. Against Job was his wrath kindled, because he justified himself rather than God. Also against his three friends was his wrath kindled, because they had found no answer, and yet had condemned Job. Now Elihu had waited till Job had spoken, because they were elder than he. So in verse number 1, the dialogue between Job and his three friends had come to an end. And they concluded. What was their conclusion for Job? Well, the conclusion what the conclusion was that they come up until Job confessed of his unconfessed sin and repented, he was hopeless in finding any relief. That's through all that dialogue that went through between his three friends and Job. That's what ultimately they came up with. Job needed to confess his unconfessed sin, repent, and then God would bless him. And they are pretty far from the truth there as we found out. Now, so what was Elihu there? In verse number 2 says that then was kindled the wrath of Elihu. And so this kindled the wrath, this kindling is, if you've ever built a fire, and other people like to build fires, but you put a lot of little kindling in there, and it kind of gets them coals on it. It gets that fire hot, and it builds that fire up. This is kind of the idea that we get with this kindled the wrath. It's a rising anger that Elihu has here. And he says it kindled his wrath of Elihu, the son of, and we spoke about who Elihu was there. Against Job was his wrath kindled, because he justified himself rather than God. Job had become a little self-righteous, many believe, and in his defense, and it had brought him to a point where he was at a point of very close to being accusing God of certain things. And this is the many people believe that this is what kindled his wrath against Elihu. Elihu had been sitting by the side. Then many people believe that this conversation that was going on between Job's three friends and Job, that a crowd may have gathered around. I'm not so sure about that. I'm not exactly sure who Elihu was. There could have been a crowd around, but the only one that spoke was Elihu. We do know that Elihu was listening, and through the dialogue that Elihu and through his speeches, we know that Elihu was there from the very beginning to the very end of the speeches, because he makes point in his speeches of all of the dialogue between the three friends of Job and Job. So we know that Elihu was there listening to the whole thing, and so we get an idea of that. But his wrath was kindled. He was just sitting there, boiled and boiled and boiled, until he just couldn't contain himself anymore. And so in verse number 3, his wrath was kindled not just against Job, but it was kindled against the three friends. Was kindled against. Now, Job's friends condemned Job without proving any of their charges against him. They just said, okay, well, we can't really prove that you have some sin in life, but we just know what you do, so we're just going to condemn you. You must repent, and you must ask God for forgiveness, and pray to the Lord, and then God will God will bless you. So they actually condemned Job without having any proof, and without proving any of the charges against him. And so we do know that according to verse number 4 that Elihu did wait till Job had spoken. Why? Because they were elder than he. So this was a young man. He was younger than Job and his three friends. So out of respect, he waited until they had completed their speeches. He waited there. So Elihu waited to speak out of respect for his elders. So this Elihu's speech, let's get an idea here, is going to, like I said before, it's kind of the go-between between the three friends and God's speech that's going to come up in chapter 38. So Elihu's speech would be a bridge between what his friends had said and what God would eventually say to Job beginning in chapter number 38. So you have Job and his three friends speaking and saying all that they said, not really solving anything, not comforting Job at all. And then Elihu comes up, and I believe that he had the right intentions, just as Job's friends had the right intentions. They just didn't follow through very well with it. I believe Elihu had the right intentions as well. I believe he was closer to the truth than was the three friends of Job's. But all of this was preparing the way and preparing Job. God was using these three friends and Elihu to prepare Job for God's answer, which will come up in chapter number 38. Now, not part of our lesson focus, but we want to make point of here to chapter 5, verses 5 through 22. Elihu had listened patiently to the lengthy dialogue of the three friends with maybe anticipation. Perhaps, Elihu, seeing that Job was here in morning and three friends had come, and he perhaps as a young man, he felt, hey, there's some wisdom here, and I can learn from these men, of how to handle the transgressions, how to handle, not transgressions, but how to handle these things that's going on in Job's life so that I can be a better servant for God. So perhaps this is he's sitting there with anticipation, waiting for wisdom to come out of the mouth of his elders, maybe to glean this wisdom, but he was only to be disappointed in their opinions, which were unprofitable. Basically, nothing the friend said was very profitable to Elihu, and maybe perhaps he was anticipating something that he could use as far as wisdom. He just didn't get it. And then we go over in chapter 33, verses 1 through 7. Elihu turns to Job. He's now spoken or about the three friends, and he turns to Job and establishes his groundwork for Job to listen. And he wanted Job to listen. He knew that he was a young man, but he wanted Job to at least listen to what he had to say. He felt like what he had to say would be beneficial to Job, and he makes point of that. Now, a lot of people said that in the way that he presented it, he was arrogant. Well, you got to realize he was young, and perhaps he was a little arrogant. But once again, I do believe he was closer to the truth than the three friends. And then we get back to what we are focusing on, verses 8. What are we looking at? Verses 8 through 13. So let's read verses 8 through 13, and then we'll come back and speak of these. Verses 8 through 13. In chapter number 33. Surely thou hast spoken in mine hearing, and I have heard the voice of thy words, saying. So this is Elihu telling Job that you have spoken in mine hearing. I've heard everything you did, and I've heard the voice of thy words. He says, and this is what Elihu says that Job said. I am clean without transgression. I am innocent. Neither is there iniquity in me. Behold, he findeth occasions against me. He counteth me for his enemy. He putteth my feet in the stocks. He marketh all my paths. Behold, in this thou art not just. I will answer thee that God is greater. I will answer them. And then Elihu comes back and says, I will answer thee that God is greater than man. Why dost thou strive against him? This is Elihu speaking back to Job. For he giveth not account of any of his matters. So Elihu in verses 8 through 11 summarizes what Job had stated in his previous speeches, and concluded that Job was in error. So we get here and we go in verse number 8, and he says, look, you've spoken where I can hear you. I have heard your voice. I've understood everything you've said, Job. What you've said is that you were clean from transgression. You were innocent, and there was no iniquity in you. And you also said that the Lord God had found occasion against me. He counted me as an enemy. And they have all the references. You can go back, the references to the scriptures there that Job was making a point. Now, this is not necessarily what Job was speaking this, or not exactly what he said here, but this is what Job made point to in the previous verses here. He also said that he putteth my feet in the stocks, he marketh all my paths. And then, so what is he talking about here? Now, according to Elihu, Job claimed to be pure and accused God of treating him as an enemy. And in this being verses 9 through 11, Job was not just. That's what he says. That's what he says in verse number 12. Behold, in this, what he stated in verses 9 through 11, what Job had stated in his previous things, Elihu calls him out, if you will, and says, thou art not just. So this just means righteous. You're not righteous in thinking like this, Job, at all. Now, unlike Job's three friends who seemed to focus more on Job's sin than on God, Elihu attempted to bring God back to the forefront of the conversation. And so where do you get that? And find that in verse number 12. Behold, in this thou art not just. I will answer thee. This is what Elihu had. Answer thee that God is greater than man. So Elihu attempts to bring God back into the forefront of which is what his friends did not necessarily do. The friends stayed focused on supposedly Job's unconfessed sin, but Elihu, it seems here, is trying his best to bring God to the forefront, back to the forefront of the conversation, because he says God is greater than man. And then verse number 13, he asked Job a question. Why dost thou strive against him? Job, why are you striving against God? And this word strive means to contend, to quarrel, to grapple, to wrangle. Now we know that and what we studied about that Job did not sin in any of these things. But we do know that Job was right there. And we know that Job was striving with God. He was trying to figure out. He had his friends in one ear saying that you just need to do something, you need to confess that specific sin. And Job said, no, I have a specific sin that's causing this pain to come upon me and this judgment. But Elihu asked him, and why do you strive? Why are you contending? Why are you quarreling? Why are you grappling? Why are you wrangling with God? What he's basically saying here is God does not have to explain anything to us. Sometimes he does not, but he does. Sometimes he does explain things to us, but he does not have to. We are accountable to him, not the other way around. God is not accountable to us. We are accountable to him. And Elihu is saying, look, Job, you are accountable to God. Quit striving with him, quit fighting with him, and just realize that God is in control. And what a great piece of advice that is. That was some great wisdom from this young man. So Elihu is trying to steer Job in the right direction. He's trying to steer him toward the fact that God's fixing to come on the scene and set things straight. And so we know that this is what Elihu is trying to do here. Now we move on to verses 17 through 18, and I'm going to read verse 17, 18, and 28 through 30. Originally in our quarterly, it just states verses 29 through 30, but I want to read these verses as well. So let's look at verses 17 and 18 in our second part, which is entitled, God Uses Suffering to Benefit Men. And verse 17 of chapter 33 says, that he may withdraw man from his purpose and hide pride from man. Now remember that the title of the part is God Uses Suffering to Benefit Man. And then verse 17 says, that he may withdraw man from his purpose and hide pride from man. He keepeth back his soul from the pit and his life from perishing by the sword. And then we look at verses 28 through 30. He says, he will deliver his soul from going into the pit, and his life shall see the light. Lo, all these things worketh God oftentimes with man, to bring back his soul from the pit, to be enlightened with the light of the living. So the question is, how is my suffering as a child of God beneficial to me? How is my suffering as a child of God beneficial to me? Well, you can find that in Romans 8:28. And we know that all things work together for everybody. Is that what it says? No, it does not say that. It says, and we know that all things work together for good to them, it's limited, that love God, to them, limited, who are the called, the saved, according to his purpose, God's purpose. So, that's how suffering can be beneficial to the saved man. Often God uses sufferings to reveal his purpose to men. If we better understand our limitations, we can more easily be led to trust in God. Now, believe it or not, God sometimes uses sufferings to keep us from even further tragedy. He may limit us. He may cause sufferings upon us so that it will save us from tragedy down the road. This is what these verses are speaking of here. You can also find that in 2 Corinthians 4:17. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. What a blessing to know that. To know that all of our sufferings, that oftentimes, not all, but oftentimes our sufferings is keeping us from further sufferings. And our sufferings are only for a time as a child of God, and then they'll be done away with. And then we will see and be a part of that far more eternal weight of glory, which is waiting for us in heaven. What a blessing this is. What a blessing it is for Elihu to try to steer Job in this direction. Now, our third part today is men should not question God. Men should not question God. We look at chapter 37. We're going to look at verse 14. And we're going to look at verses 21 through 24. Hearken unto this, O Job. Stand still and consider the wondrous works of God. Once again, this is Elihu. Once again, trying to give Job some advice here. Speaking to Job. And in verses 21 through 24, he says, And now men see not the bright light which is in the clouds, but the wind passeth and cleanseth them. Fair weather cometh out of the north. With God is terrible majesty. Touching the Almighty, we cannot find him out. He is excellent in power and in judgment, and in plenty of justice. He will not afflict. Men do therefore fear him. He respecteth not any that are wise of heart. Elihu encouraged Job to stop and consider the wondrous works of God and his creation. May we today recognize the awesomeness of God and bow before him in total submission. Now, I know this was a lot of chapters, 32 through 37. We condensed this in some 20 to 25 minutes. But we need to have an understanding that Elihu, once again, I don't believe Elihu was perfect in what he was saying. I do believe that he was closer to the truth than was Job's three friends. This young man came on the scene, could not hold his tongue anymore, and just laid it out for Job. He may have been a little arrogant, but I believe that God used him for Job's benefit. He didn't necessarily accuse Job, but he was not perfect like what God's words are going to be in chapter 38. But he used what he had. He used the wisdom that he had and what he had heard from the others about how not to be a comforter, a friend of comfort, and attempted to help Job to come back from this travesty and this tragedy that had been fallen on him. So, with that being said, next week God is going to make an appearance and set everything and everyone right. I hope you have a blessed day.